The desert morning rose with a brutal stillness, the kind that pressed against the skin like punishment, and Callahan Voss could feel it sinking into his bones as he dismounted beside the strange wooden cage, sitting alone in an ocean of heat and sand. It wasn't built with iron bars or locks meant for livestock, but with splintered wagon planks, sun-hardened rope, and a cruelty so intentional it soured the air around it. Inside, a woman hung against the frame, her wrists chained, her body half collapsed, raw skin burned from the merciless sun, her dark hair matted with dust, and her Apache dress torn in ways that told stories no one should ever have to live through. She wasn't just abandoned, she was meant to vanish slowly, painfully. Callahan approached with the same caution he'd use for a wounded animal, boots crunching over sand that shimmered under the punishing heat, and even in her condition, the woman snapped her head up with a fierceness that didn't match her frail body. Her eyes, dark and burning, didn't hold relief when they met his, they held rage, suspicion, and a warning to keep his distance. He offered his canteen anyway, and though her pride fought it, survival won, her hand shooting forward to grab it in a desperate, shaking motion, water spilling down her chin as she drank with a mix of hunger and disbelief. She dropped the empty canteen like it was a weapon no longer needed. While she studied him with wary calculation, Callahan circled the cage, examined the padlocked chain anchoring her to the earth, and understood immediately that whoever left her here never intended for her to walk away. When he drew his revolver, she tensed as if expecting the worst, but he only aimed at the chain and told her to cover her ears. She didn't, too stubborn or too proud, but the shot cracked anyway, echoing off distant rocks as the padlock snapped free and fell uselessly into the sand. He started to cut the ropes around her wrists, but before he'd even touched her, she hit him weak, but fierce enough that he tasted blood, spitting iron before she rasped out the first words he heard from her. "You don't touch me, I won't be owned." The statement wasn't for him, it was carved from survival. He crouched low, made himself smaller, spoke quietly, honestly, offering her freedom, water, and a chance to live, but not control. She asked him why he cared if she died, and his answer, because someone should hung between them like a truth neither of them knew how to accept. When she finally nodded permission, he cut her free, the rope giving way with a brittle snap, her raw wrists trembling with new, unfamiliar liberty. But when her legs collapsed, Callahan caught her, feeling her body go rigid with resistance, even as her strength abandoned her completely. And when riders appeared on the horizon, dust rising behind fast, determined horses, the fear she'd kept buried broke through her expression, whispering that they'd come back for her. Callahan didn't hesitate. He lifted her onto his mare. Ash climbed up behind her, wrapped an arm around her to keep her from falling, and kicked the horse into motion, sand exploding beneath hooves as shouts and gunfire erupted behind them. Even half-conscious, she refused to lean on him, clinging instead to the saddle horn with white-knuckled stubbornness. Bullets chased them across burning ground, but Callahan aimed for the canyon ahead, a narrow cut in the rock where they could vanish long enough to breathe. When they reached the shadowed alcove inside the canyon, he dismounted and tried to help her stand, but her body folded, trembling, starved, and she whispered that if she stopped fighting, she'd die. He knelt in front of her, steady and unshaken, and asked for her name, not because he needed it, but because speaking it The canyon walls swallowed sound as Callahan knelt in front of the woman, her breathing shallow, her eyes still sharp despite the exhaustion threatening to pull her under. And when he asked for her name, she hesitated as if the word belonged to a life she no longer trusted. Finally, she whispered Kaya, the syllables rough, scraped dry by days of silence and suffering. The rider's distant echoes bounced down the canyon corridors, reminding them both that time was running thin, and Callahan knew they couldn't linger not with men willing to chain someone up like an animal and leave them to die. He listened carefully, gauging distance by the way the horse's hooves sent tremors through the stone. Then looked at Kaya, who was struggling just to remain upright, her hands trembling violently as she tried to push herself away from the canyon wall, refusing help even when her body betrayed her. Pride, like hers, didn't bend. It broke. And yet he reached for her again, slower this time, his voice low and steady, as he told her he needed to lift her back onto the horse. She stared at him with suspicion, pain, and something else, something like shame for finally letting her head rest briefly against the rock behind her, a sign of surrender, so small that most men would have missed it. Callahan didn't. He lifted her carefully, feeling the bones too sharp beneath her skin, the weakness in her limbs, and an anger rose inside him, not at her, but at whoever had done this. Ash snorted, ears flicking nervously as the air shifted, dust drifting down from the canyon lip above. Someone was close. Callahan hoisted Kaya onto the saddle and swung up behind her, his arm sliding round her waist to hold her steady. She tensed, but didn't fight him this time. When he clicked his tongue, Ash surged forward, deeper into the canyon hooves, striking stone, echoing down the twisting path as they navigated sharp turns and sudden drops of shadow. Kaya's head drooped forward until it rested lightly against his chest, too weak to resist the pull of gravity, and though she tried to lift it, her body refused. "Don't," he murmured. "Save your strength." She hated that she needed him. He could feel the bitterness in every breath she drew. But she stayed where she was, out of necessity. The canyon tightened, and Callahan slowed the horse, scanning the walls for movement. He spotted a narrow ledge ahead, wide enough for a horse, but hidden by an overhang of jagged stone, a place where they could pull aside and let the riders pass them by if luck stayed on their side. He guided Ash up the incline, positioning them in the shadowed shelf high above the canyon floor. Kaya clutched the saddle horn with shaking fingers as voices echoed below, harsh and angry, men calling out to each other in a language that carried more violence than the words themselves. Callahan held them still, barely breathing, his hand splayed over Kaya's stomach to keep her from collapsing sideways as her legs twitched involuntarily from pain. She whispered something he almost missed. "They were supposed to kill me, not take me back," and the small tremor in her voice cut through him like a blade. He wanted to ask who they were, why they wanted her dead, what she had escaped from, but the riders came into view beneath them. 4 men on horseback, scanning the canyon with guns drawn, dust swirling around their boots. Kaya stiffened, her breath catching sharply, and Callahan could feel the dread radiating off her in cold waves. One rider paused, looking up at the ledges, scanning the shadows dangerously close to where they hid. Callahan wrapped his arm more tightly around Kaya, grounding her, silently promising without words that he wouldn't let them take her. Not again, not ever. After an agonizing moment, the riders moved on, their shouts fading into the distance. Callahan waited long after they were gone before nudging Ash back onto the path, feeling Kaya sag against him, not in trust, but in complete physical defeat. She was almost unconscious when he spoke. "Kaya, whoever they are, you're not going back." Her eyes flickered open, barely, and her voice broke on a whisper. "You don't know what they are." And he knew then that whatever he had stepped into was darker than a simple rescue. It was a war he hadn't meant to join. The moment the riders disappeared beyond the bend, Callahan urged Ash forward, keeping one arm wrapped firmly around Kaya's waist to keep her from tipping out of the saddle as they descended the rocky slope and emerged into a wider stretch of canyon where the cliffs opened enough for the wind to weave through and carry the scent of distant water. Kaya stirred weakly, her eyelids fluttering as she fought to stay conscious. Stubbornness etched into every tremor of her body, as if she refused to let unconsciousness win simply because it meant surrender. Callahan could feel heat radiating off her, fever rising, dehydration sinking deeper into her bones, and he knew they were running out of time. If he didn't get her water soon, they'd lose the fragile advantage they'd carved out by slipping past her pursuers. The canyon widened into a gravel bed, split by a shallow trickle of water that wove through the stones like a silver thread, and Callahan steered Ash straight toward it, sliding off the saddle as soon as the horse's hooves touched the creek bed. He reached up to catch Kaya as she slumped sideways, her hands fumbling for purchase until she gave up and let him lower her to the ground. Her breath hitched when the cold water touched her cracked lips, and she flinched as if even kindness burned, but she didn't push him away this time. She let him lift the canteen to her mouth, let him press the wet cloth to her forehead, let him hold her steady when her body shook so fiercely she seemed ready to split apart. The resistance wasn't gone, just buried under necessity. Callahan could see the fury simmering beneath her exhaustion, fury at her own weakness, at the men who'd hunted her, at fate itself. But the deeper heat inside her wasn't the fever. It was something harder, forged through years of surviving the wrong kind of men. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, scraping out of her throat like sand dragged over stone. "I didn't expect you to stay." Callahan didn't answer at first. He wrung out the bandana again, placed it over the back of her neck, listening to the sound of the water slipping over rocks like a heartbeat steadying itself. "I'm not the kind of man who leaves someone behind," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm enough to echo slightly between the canyon walls. "Even if she bites like a wounded wolf." That earned the faintest twitch of her lips, something close to a smile, but too pained, too weary to fully form. The sky above them shifted from harsh midday glare to the softer warmth of late afternoon, shadows stretching long across the rock as Kaya slowly regained enough control over her body to sit with his support. She looked around the canyon like someone who hadn't seen open sky in years, and maybe she hadn't, not in any way that mattered. When Callahan asked her how long she'd been in the cage, she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she cupped a handful of creek water and let it fall through her fingers, watching it disappear into dust. "Long enough," she said finally. "Long enough, they thought it would break me." Her voice hardened. It didn't. Callahan studied her in silence, admiring the way defiance lived in her even when strength did not. And he wondered not for the first time what kind of life had shaped someone like her. She leaned forward suddenly, gripping the sides of his vest to keep from collapsing, and whispered, "They'll come again. They won't stop." Callahan rested a steadying hand on her back. "Good," he said. "Let them come. I'll be ready." She let out a ragged breath, half laughter, half grief, and lowered her forehead to his shoulder, not in trust but in necessity, borrowing his strength because hers had run thin. And in that moment, with the sky darkening, with the creek whispering around their boots, Callahan understood something dangerous saving her wasn't a task he'd chosen. It was already becoming a promise he couldn't walk away from. Night settled over the canyon like a slow-falling curtain, the sky deepening into blue-black velvet flecked with cold, distant stars. And Callahan built a small fire in the natural alcove he'd chosen, tucked between two jutting slabs of stone, sheltered enough to hide the glow from prying eyes. Kaya lay wrapped in his spare blanket, her body still trembling intermittently from fever, though the worst had broken earlier. Now she drifted in and out of awareness, her eyes opening only long enough to track his movements before sliding shut again, as if every heartbeat was a negotiation between survival and surrender. Callahan kept watch beside her, rifle across his knees, his hat pulled low as he listened to the canyon breeze wind curling through rock, insects humming in dry brush, the soft crackle of burning wood. Every sound mattered, every silence mattered more. When Kaya stirred again, pushing herself upright, despite her body's protests, he moved instinctively to steady her, but she swatted his hand away with what little strength she had left, a ghost of her earlier fire returning. "I'm not fragile," she muttered, though the effort of sitting left her breathless. "Didn't say you were," he answered calmly, and she shot him a sharp, weary glare that almost made him smile because it meant she was still fighting. She studied him through the flickering light, eyes dark and reflective, and asked the question that had been simmering in her silence for hours. "Why do you keep helping me?" Callahan poked the fire with a stick, watching sparks scatter like tiny stars. "Because leaving you behind would make me the kind of man I refuse to become." Kaya considered that, shoulders slumping as the truth of her situation pressed in on her again. She wasn't used to relying on anyone. She wasn't built for it. Trust was a blade she'd learned to keep sheathed, because every time she'd shown it, someone had cut deeper. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, staring into the flames. "Nakoma isn't like Coleman," she said abruptly, her voice low. "He doesn't stop when he wants something. He doesn't stop even when he gets it. He keeps going until there's nothing left." Callahan's jaw tightened. Good thing he's hunting someone who bites back. That earned a quiet exhale from her, almost a laugh, but it dissolved into a wince as pain shot through her ribs. Callahan reached for her again, and this time she didn't shove him away. She let him ease her back down, her eyes drifting shut as exhaustion pulled at her edges. He watched her breathe, watched the flicker of dreams or memories tighten her face, and wondered how long she'd been running from a man who believed he had a right to own her. The fire burned low, and the canyon chilled, wind whistling through stone like an old ghost. Somewhere far off, an owl called, its cry bouncing through the cliffs. Callahan remained alert, muscles coiled, his senses tuned to every whisper of danger. Hours passed before Kaya woke again, more lucid this time, her gaze clearer as she studied him through the dim light. "If you stay with me," she said softly, "you'll die for me." Her voice didn't tremble with fear, but with the certainty of someone who had seen enough death to recognize patterns before they formed. Callahan didn't look away. "If I leave you," he replied, "you'll die alone." The honesty between them hung heavy, like a rope pulled taut. She swallowed, her throat tight, and whispered, "I don't want to owe you my life." "You don't," he said. "You're fighting for it. I'm just giving you a chance to finish the fight." She stared at him a long moment, something unspoken passing through her eyes, recognition, understanding, maybe gratitude buried under too much scar tissue to rise to the surface. Finally, she laid back down, her voice barely audible. "You shouldn't care about me." Callahan shifted his rifle, gaze returning to the canyon shadows as he answered, "Yeah, I know, but here we are." And in the quiet that followed, beneath the moonlit cliffs, both of them realized the same truth. Running was no longer simple, and neither were they. Dawn crept into the canyon in thin bands of pale gold, sliding across the rock like hesitant fingers, testing the world's edges. And Callahan was already awake when the first light touched Kaya's face, illuminating the exhaustion etched into her features, yet also revealing a new steadiness in her eyes. The kind born after a night where the body loses its war with fever, but the will refuses to break. She pushed herself upright, slower than she wanted to appear, but capable now, her breaths deeper, her gaze clearer, as she scanned the surroundings with instinctive wariness. Callahan offered her the canteen without a word, and though she hesitated if accepting anything from him cost her something, she took it, drinking in careful sips. A silence stretched between them, not hostile, not strained, but thick with everything they hadn't yet said. Finally, Kaya broke it. "You should leave before they find you," she said, wiping the water from her mouth with the back of her hand. "I told you," Callahan replied gently. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked away sharply, jaw tightening. "Then you're a fool, probably," he agreed without offense. She wasn't prepared for him to agree so easily, and it unsettled her, unraveling the walls she'd kept so rigidly in place. She stood, unsteady but determined, brushing dust from her legs as she paced a few steps away from the fire pit. The morning cold nipping at her bare arms. The canyon felt different today, quieter, but not safer. When she turned back to Callahan, her expression had shifted, not softer, but more honest. "You said they won't take me," she murmured. "But you don't know Nakoma. He thinks everything in this world owes him something." Callahan rose to his feet, dusting off his hands. "Then he'll learn something new." Kaya let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief, almost like relief. She didn't want to rely on him, he could see that, but she also didn't want to face Nakoma alone, not after everything that had already been stripped from her. They packed the small camp quickly, Callahan securing the saddle, while Kaya checked the revolver he'd given her, spinning the drum with practiced familiarity. When she caught him watching her, she lifted her chin, as if daring him to question her competence. He didn't. "You shoot better than most men I've met," he said instead. Her lips twitched. "Most men you've met haven't needed to learn as fast as I did." They mounted Ash together, Kaya gripping the saddle horn as they started toward the canyon's northern exit, where jagged cliffs opened into a sweeping stretch of open desert. She scanned every ridge, every shadow, every cluster of mesquite with twitching nerves, her instincts warning her long before any sound reached them. Then she felt it, a wrongness in the air, a prickle along her spine, like a hunter's breath. against the back of her neck. "Stop," she whispered sharply. Callahan halted Ash immediately. Kaya pointed to the ridge above. At first he saw nothing but sunlit stone, then movement, subtle, purposeful, shapes shifting behind crests of rock. Not close enough to attack, but close enough to track. "They're following," she said. "Not rushing this time. They're waiting for a mistake." Callahan's grip tightened on the reins. "Then we won't make one." Their eyes met hers, sharp, his steady, and, for the first time, neither looked away. The desert stretched ahead like a test neither had wanted, but both were now bound to face together. Kaya squared her shoulders, strength returning in a way that had nothing to do with water or food. Callahan nudged the horse forward, and Kaya whispered, almost to herself, "If they want a chase, we'll give them one." And with the rising sun casting long shadows across the sand, the two of them rode out of the canyon and into a future that was beginning to feel less like survival and more like fate unfolding step by step beside them. The desert wind rose with the late afternoon heat as Callahan and Kaya pushed deeper into the open plains, the land stretching endlessly around them like a vast, unmoving sea of dust and scorched brush. And though the horizon looked empty, both of them felt the weight of being hunted pressing against their backs with every passing mile. Kaya kept turning her head, her sharp eyes tracking the faint silhouettes that appeared and disappeared along the far ridges. Shadows that moved like wolves pacing their prey, patient yet relentless. Callahan rode with his jaw set, scanning the land ahead for a defensible route, but the desert offered no kindness, no canyons to hide in, no rock formations tall enough to break line of sight, only open ground where any fight would end fast and brutal. As the sun dipped lower, Kaya tapped Callahan's arm and pointed to a cluster of wind-bent Joshua trees beside a cracked basin. "Water used to pool there," she said. "If they think we'll stop for it, they might try to circle ahead." Her thinking impressed him sharp, strategic, shaped by survival rather than pride. "Then we won't stop," he said. But Kaya's breath faltered for a moment. She was stronger now, far stronger than yesterday, yet her body hadn't forgotten the torture she endured, and the long ride was wearing on her. She hated that he noticed, hated even more that he slowed Ash to match her breathing. "Don't look at me like that," she muttered. "Like what? Like I'll break?" Callahan's voice softened without losing edge. "I know exactly how breakable people are, and I'm still not letting you fall." The words hit deeper than he intended, and Kaya looked away quickly, gripping the saddle horn as if grounding herself. Before either could say more, a rifle shot cracked across the desert, slicing the air with a violent whistle as it struck the ground inches from Ash's hooves. The horse reared, Kaya grabbing Callahan's arm for balance as he steadied them both. Dust erupted from a second shot closer, aimed to warn, not kill. "They're pushing us east," Kaya realized, toward the dry flats. Callahan cursed. Under his breath, the flats were open death zones, with no cover for miles. The riders weren't reckless, they were hurting them, forcing a confrontation on their terms. "Hold on," Callahan said, pulling the reins sharply as he veered Ash toward a thin cut in the land, barely noticeable from afar, a shallow erosion channel twisting through the dirt like a hidden scar. They ducked into it just as a third bullet sparked off a stone behind them. The trench offered only waist-high walls, but it was enough to break line of sight. Kaya hopped off the horse before it fully stopped, her boots skidding in loose gravel. As she crouched low, loading the revolver with practiced efficiency. "How many?" Callahan asked. She listened, really listened, the way only someone raised in these lands could. 4, maybe 5. "One of them is Nakoma. I'd know his stupid breath, even in a storm." Callahan allowed himself half a smirk. "Good. I've been meaning to meet him." She shot him a look that was half warning, half gratitude, masked in annoyance. The riders' shadows grew at the trench's edge, dust swirling in violent spirals above as hooves thundered closer. Kaya's pulse steadied into something fierce, something alive. Callahan drew his rifle and took position beside her, there, shoulders nearly touching. "We end this here," she whispered. "Together," he answered. And for the first time since her capture, Kaya believed they might outrun fate, or carve a new one with their own hands. As the first rider's silhouette appeared against the blazing orange sky, Kaya exhaled, raised her weapon, and prepared to fight, not as prey, not as a fugitive, but as a woman reclaiming her life. With a man beside her who had chosen her safety over every rule he'd ever lived by.